Terrific.
I think the music stopped, Rob.
The music stops, so we got to start. We have to fill the time, John.
Just ask questions slowly.
Prolonged one, we will. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rob Nicholson. I'm a managing director with RBC Capital Markets in the Power Utility Infrastructure Group, and I've had the fine pleasure of working with Mr. Kousinioris for many, many years and many of the folks in his organization. And if you don't know John, John's an accomplished lawyer, reformed.
Failed.
Okay, his words, not mine. And now is the CEO of TransAlta, which has been one of the largest coal-fired generators in Canada, but now no longer.
No longer.
So congratulations, that's
Thank
fantastic.
You. Yeah.
So our topic today is regarding really power demand, and specifically we've heard some conversations this morning about AI and data centers. So that's going to be our focus. But John, before we go there, your organization has operations in Australia, in the United States, and in Canada. And level set today, if you could, those different power markets. What's the status? Before we load on data centers, where are we in, say, Australia and the United States and Canada in terms of the grid and how it works and those kinds of things?
They're very, so thank you for the introduction. They're very, very different, the three markets. I would say, the US is such a large market that it's almost impossible to talk about in a sort of a generalized way. But we have significant operations in the Pacific Northwest. That's an important part of the business for us. It is a bilateral market, very different to the market that we have here in Alberta, which is an energy-only market. It is growing rapidly. Population growth, industrial growth, discussions around data centers, a very strong push towards renewables in that part of the world, and increasingly they're having reliability problems. And I'll come back to that sort of thematically, because although each of the three jurisdictions are different, the challenges that they're facing are in many respects the same. Western Australia is a relatively small market. It's about 25% or so of the size of Alberta, for example, in terms of the size of the load. Strong mining, a lot of behind-the-fence remote generation. They have more of a regulated market, so they have capacity pricing, energy pricing, and they too are struggling with an increase in renewables at the same time trying to make sure that their grid is reliable. And then here in Alberta, maybe I'll just talk briefly about Alberta and Ontario. We tend to think of Ontario as sort of a quasi-regulated market and a bit of a contracted. I'm not sure what Ontario is. Rob, you live there, you tell me. But an interesting market, and also looking to procure quite a bit of generation right now. I think that's something that's taking place there. And interestingly, increasingly, at least the theme seems to be sort of technology agnostic in terms of where they're coming in. And then Alberta, which is our principal market, our core market, kind of a unique energy-only market where there isn't sort of a separate capacity price that is paid to generators. So everything comes out from a compensation perspective in the hourly price that takes place, and a market that's undergoing quite a bit of regulatory change, I would say, probably more regulatory change than any of the other markets that we're in. We had a renewables pause that is now over, with a little bit more scrutiny around everything from reclamation to participation in regulatory processes, to certain parts of the province being sort of offside in terms of renewables development, and are now in the middle of a market renewal process, and that'll take a little bit of time, I think, for us to work through. So quite a bit of, quite different, but thematically, this is what I wanted to sort of say. All three jurisdictions are broadly struggling with how they're going to balance three components. People often hear me and people in our industry talk about a three-legged stool that needs to be in balance in order for things to work well, and that's affordability, reliability, and clean. Things have to be decarbonized. And all three markets, to a greater or lesser extent, are struggling with meeting the needs of those in a balanced way, and I don't think anybody has a good solution for it. And I think there's a lot of work to happen, and unfortunately, I think we're going to sort of stumble through the evolution, I think, or the energy transition that's take place in all three markets struggling to meet the needs of affordability, reliability, and decarbonization. A lot of emphasis on decarbonization over the last number of years. At times, I think, Rob, if we're honest, at the expense of affordability and reliability. And we see reliability problems in Alberta. We see reliability problems in the Pacific Northwest. And we see reliability problems in Western Australia. And I think they're going to probably become, I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect they're going to become more acute over time, rather, until they get better.
So
we could talk about this for like an hour.
Yeah. No, that's, well, we're not going to talk about just that specifically for an hour, but maybe just summarizing, I guess what I've heard from you is they're working, but maybe they're at a level of stress that you could put them on a tipping point. Is that fair?
I think it's probably fair, yeah.
Okay. So when we think about AI, so AI, we've heard a little bit this morning, but we've heard that, for example, the increase in AI between 2015 and 2019 more than doubled, yet the power demand did not go up at all. I don't know if people know that, but that's sort of the rumor out there. And primarily that was driven by data centers actually becoming more efficient and the use of electricity. But the belief is that that curve is sort of declining in their ability to increase efficiency. And so when we hear about numbers, I'm going to throw a couple out there, John, because
I hate it when you do that.
I'm a math guy and I like numbers. But it's predicted in the US, so the US in 2022, 3% of the electricity in the United States was dedicated for data centers and AI uses. And in 2030, which is only 8 years later, it's going to be 8%.
I just saw 12.
Okay, well there we go. Nobody really knows, but it's a big number, right? To go from 3
Let's say
to
10.
8 to 12,
we'll go 10.
Something like that. So when we think about that, what does that mean? You own a power generation company. Generation doesn't necessarily directly plug into an AI data center. So paint a picture for me about if we have an increase like that, what does that mean in practical sense?
Yeah, so look, I think the numbers that you talked about are actually right. So I think if you were to look at sort of the mid-2000s, so from about 2005, frankly, till the late teens, load was pretty flat. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, it actually declined, which is something we saw happen in a bunch of places all over the world. There was greater efficiency in terms of what was being done. Some places deindustrialized, so you tended to see load fall or flat in other jurisdictions. Alberta was a little bit different. We continued to have load growth, but I'd say it was pretty modest, sort of 1-ish%, 1.5%, kind of in that range. Today, we're hearing people talk about 3.5% per year increase in load. And to your point on data centers, the last bit of information that I heard is if you go sort of from now to 2030, you're looking at somewhere between 20 to 25%, a compound annual growth rate in the demand that data centers are going to have. So it's sort of staggering. And I think what that translates, and I think you can work by analogy to Canada, if that is right from a prediction perspective, you're going to need somewhere like 50 to 60 gigawatts of new generation installed in the US, kind of conservatively, which just to give people a bit of perspective is sort of 2.5 times to 3 times the amount of installed capacity that a province like Alberta has. Like, it's not an insignificant sum. And the latest numbers I saw on that, Rob, were I think that's about a $500 billion spend, roughly, to get done. And that excludes the data centers, like the equipment that go in a data center, and it excludes all wires. So no transmission, no distribution, literally, just generation and kind of the box that you would put the data centers in. I don't know how we do that in that time period, candidly. And I don't know how we do it in a way that continues to ensure that kind of our broad decarbonization goals continue to evolve. And I think you're seeing it. I think you're seeing it all over the US. It hasn't become as acute in Canada, but I think if you look at what's happened in the US, to the extent data centers come to Canada, I think you could see sort of analogies taking place. I mean, you look at North Virginia or the northern part of Virginia, which is sort of data center central in the US. Something like 25% of their load is now data centers. 25%. That's happened pretty quickly. I think the second largest jurisdiction in terms of demand is actually, I think it's North Dakota, with something like 15%.
Wow.
And you're already seeing a number of jurisdictions kind of saying, like, we're done. So, in Virginia, it is really challenging to build, like, they're overwhelmed. And they're getting demands for something like 15 to 20 new data centers every year. The Silicon Valley area, I think it's Santa Clara County, has basically said, like, we're done. The Phoenix area, which has really taken off, is done. And it's not just North America. I mean, if you were to look at places globally, Singapore and Amsterdam, kind of that area in central Holland, were also big hubs for data. They're also kind of going, like, we can't deal with the demand and kind of tie it in, and deal with it. So it's super challenging. If it takes, I don't know, a year to permit something, if it takes 2 years or 3 years to get the hardware you need from a supply chain perspective to actually build it out, then you need to build it. There's a shortage of labor, candidly, all over North America to get it done. So just from a path, just being honest about it, getting from where we are today to where, in theory, we need to be by 2030, I don't know how you do it. I know people don't want to hear that, but I'm just telling you, I just don't know that it can be done without breaking things or resulting in astronomical costs. Like it takes 3 years to get a turbine today for a gas plant. It can take sort of 2 years to get wind turbines sorted out, and then you've got to get them delivered, and you've got to build it. And I think permitting takes longer than ever before. I remember speaking to one of our colleagues on our board who runs a large solar development company in the U.S. And I remember years ago she would talk about kind of a development cycle being sort of 3 years long to get something done from when it became a vision of getting, and it's like 7 or 8. So I just don't know how you go from where we are to where we kind of need to be.
So you've said a lot there, and I want to break down some of those parts.
I hate it when you do that.
But if we think about trying to build 50 gigawatts, and maybe for people who aren't...
That's just in the US, like it's just...
For people who aren't power people, think of a large, a nuclear plant, give or take, is a gigawatt. So if we have to build 50...
50 to 60, you need 50 of them, 60 of them.
And a gas-fired plant is, give or take, maybe 500 to a gigawatt, depending on how many turbines. But anyway, the point is, we're going to need 50 to 60 at least new facilities in a 5-year or 7-year time frame is the prediction. So I guess the question is, it doesn't sound like that's possible from your perspective, but what about if we combine resources from a gas facility, some wind, some solar? Like, how do we put the puzzle together? Do we need to go all in on one, or do we try everything, or what do we do?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, I'll be honest, Rob. I mean, I think you're going to need all of the above to kind of meet it, because I don't think it makes sense to sort of say, we're going to ignore kind of our renewables targets, and we're just going to go with thermal to make sure that we can provide kind of a stable grid to permit all of that to take place. So I think it will require balance, whether it's on the same project or not, or whether it's, more broadly speaking, in the grid. So I think it requires, all the comments on the investment that's required and kind of the attributes or characteristics of it are going to continue. And it's not just data centers, right? Like generally, we've seen a ton of digitization take place. We're in the infancy of EVs. Like you got to be, just beginning in terms of, demand. You've got, AIs that are coming. Cloud computing is also significant. And what's interesting is the more we do, the more it actually creates demand. If you see what I mean, it isn't sort of linear. It creates this sort of geometric. You're asking a failed lawyer to talk about mathematical concepts. It's always a bit alarming. But the demand is actually difficult, and the efficiency that comes from chips and whatnot is actually slower. In other words, the time it takes for them to improve the efficiency is taking longer. So there was a time where every year...
Moore's law is breaking down.
There you go. See, I knew you knew all this stuff. So all of this is making it harder to basically do. But I just think it's hard to do. Like we have basically 3 in the Western world wind generation OEMs. 3. I mean, it's Vestas, it's Siemens, it's GE, that's it. They're busy, like they're operating flat out. In terms of turbines, I mean, it's mostly GE and probably Siemens in terms of what, you're seeing. They're full, like they're busy. I just don't know, solar is, I think, a little bit, you have a more flexible, I think, supply chain, and I think the costs have come down, but it's challenging. And just to give you a bit of a sense, and you and I talk about this all the time, I remember 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we used to think about, how much it would cost to build a wind farm, for example, and it was about $1.5 million a megawatt, roughly speaking. That's like 2.2 million today, and climbing, Canadian. So, that's in part supply chain challenges, but like the inflationary impact. Do I think it's going to come down? Sure, but it's popped up, right? Solar's come down, gas is pricey. So I don't know, Rob, how you do it. I wish I did.
You're not painting the rosiest picture I've ever seen, John.
No, look, I think you need to have a clear-eyed. I think there's a difference. So it's easy to kind of say we're entering into this unprecedented and unbelievably, sort of exciting period, and we're going to be able to decarbonize and be able to meet all of the electricity demand that we need. And I think it's going to be bloody tough. Like, I hate to say it. I think it's going to be hard to do it. I think it's going to be hard to do it in an affordable way. And I think, creating kind of the policy environment that gives you the kind of certainty that you need to be able to make those kinds of investments is also challenging. So am I excited as somebody that leads an independent power producer? Hugely excited. I think the opportunity set is huge, like unprecedented, kind of a once in a generational kind of opportunity. But I think it's going to be challenged to kind of hit all of the holistic targets that we have. If you see what I'm saying.
So
Could be wrong, but I unfortunately I don't think I am.
When an Amazon shows up at your doorstep or Microsoft, what are they asking of you as a power generator? What they come to the door and they say, we want to build a 200 megawatt load next door to this location, and can you supply us power?
Yeah, it's changed. And look, at Amazon, Microsoft, these are customers that we have in our company. And I would say it's evolving right now. And maybe I won't speak about them. I'll talk about sort of the more generic kind of discussion that we're having. I would say 2 and 3 years ago, it was more about, can you build us a wind farm? Can you do it on time? What's the time frame going to take? We've got targets. It was more macro decarbonization as opposed to, I've got a specific data center I need you to sort of power. So they were more concerned about cost, and they were very much concerned about, will it actually be built? Because there were so many examples of people agreeing to build out projects, and they didn't actually materialize over the course of time. So they were quite picky, I would say, about who the counterparty was, and did they have a track record of actually delivering the power that they promised to deliver at the appropriate time. It's much more nuanced today. I would say, certainly from a data center perspective, at least the kinds of discussions we're having, and our discussions are very much Alberta-focused discussions. They're not in Western Australia, and they're not really yet in the Pacific Northwest, and there's some challenges in the Pac Northwest that probably make that, at least for us, a little bit more challenging. But when I think about Alberta, it's just speed, primarily. Like, I have to tell you, the decarbonization discussion is not...
It's not a thing.
No. Well, it's not that it's not a thing. It isn't driving the decision-making. It is speed. How quickly, do you have a grid connection? How quickly could I get power from you? It's sort of time to power, candidly, would be the number one thing. Because the reality is today, the development cycle, the time cycle for development, is longer than the time cycle for the development of the data center, if you see what I mean. Right. So they're compressed they're challenged from a timing perspective. And I think the other thing that's interesting about data centers is sort of the economic model has kind of changed. So, they're less price sensitive about the power. So, it's not like it's sort of an industrial concern where power might be 60% of the process. Let's say you're making hydrogen, and power really matters because it's 80% of the cost or whatever, right, is power. With a typical data center, the cost of electricity in that sort of construct is like 20%. In other words, it's not an irrelevant. It is very much relevant, but your project won't, the price of power isn't going to make or break kind of, making your investment decisions. So they're willing to pay a bit more, candidly, in exchange for just having access to the power in a kind of a real-time sort of way. That may change over time, but so the green part, at least, speaking about our perspective, it hasn't been, to date anyways, in the context of Alberta, a significant driver. I think when things normalize more, and maybe over time it will be, if you see what I mean, like they'll probably come back and revisit things over time and think about greening up the generation that they have. And look, we're uniquely able to say, look, we've got wind, we've got hydro, so there's ways that we can use kind of our portfolio to kind of decarbonize the offering. But they want 99.9% reliability, and they want speed. And I don't know how at least in Alberta, we can't provide that in a green way right now.
I think it's important to understand, if you don't know too much about TransAlta, they do have wind, you do have solar, and you do have hydro and gas expertise. So
we even have coal still. Yeah.
You still have the gamut,
in the US, yeah.
And it really is what gets built when.
Right.
You talked a little bit earlier about how we're done, whether it's Virginia.
I don't think I ever said that. Like that.
Well, didn't do that? Okay. Sorry, it was this then. I don't know what it was. It was some action. Anyway, that we're done, right? We're done in Texas. We're done in Virginia. California is saying we don't have any more room for you.
It's slowing down, I think, is what I meant. Like you can't just sort of sign up and here you go, right? It's not plug and play.
So there has been some resistance. We're hearing more about local resistance to building out these big data centers. People are starting to realize that it actually has an impact on their retail price of electricity at home.
Yeah.
It has an impact on water supply. It has multiple impacts. And if you think about, there was a discussion earlier this morning a little bit about how latency isn't necessarily all that important anymore, or not as important.
Not as important, I'd say, yeah.
I'm not going to say it's not important, but not as important. So if you think about, again, the big constructors of these data centers, where do they go? I mean, a number of the states you already identified that were the logical ones are kind of done. Where do we go? Do we see more here in Canada? Do we see it coming across the border in Mexico? I don't know. What do we see?
We may do. Like I think, continuing to increase load in highly populated jurisdictions, especially ones that have sort of a very, rigid's the wrong word, I can't think of the right word, Rob, but like a regulated kind of construct, I think is becoming harder. I think, when you look at the transmission build out, when I think you're looking at water use, I think you touched on all the kinds of things. People are very sensitive to pricing. They're also pretty sensitive to the time frames. I mean, there's an active discussion right now in parts of the US where some of the utilities are saying, look, I need you to give me some sense of certainty so I can build out this transmission line. I'm going to need like 10 years or 15 years of certainty to actually make that investment. And there's a reluctance to kind of give that level of assurance. Well, I don't know how they're going to make the investment, because what they're worried about is people leave. And then you've got retail consumers holding the bag to pay, all of the infrastructure that's basically built out. So it's challenging. I think one of the reasons we've seen the build out in SPP, kind of that middle spine of the US, they've got good resources. But when you think of the Iowas of the world, North Dakota, those kinds of jurisdictions, I'd say population light. Do you know what I mean? Probably a bit easier to get stuff cited and permitted that might end up taking if you were trying to do it in Southern Connecticut, or in New York or North Virginia, which is basically a suburb of Washington D.C. And so I think over time it will, because it isn't just the data center, it's all of the associated wires, and to your point, cooling equipment, costs. I think it's an issue everywhere, and I think both the power developers and the data center companies are going to need to spend more time engaging with the population. We see it now. There is definitely more, again, for lack of a better way of expressing it, NIMBYism, and some of it's justified. Like, people are concerned. They're concerned about what it means to their power bills 5 years from now. They're concerned about, like, does it actually create any jobs or not? Not really, once it's built. Even though they're, at least in the States, they're kind of estimating it's sort of like up to 500,000 people short to build out. the demand is, but once the construction is done, it's not like you're going to employ like 500 people at the facility. Like it kind of runs, you know what I mean, at the plant. So I think it's going to require more engagement, and as things get more congested, if I can put it that way, I think it's going to become harder still.
So your organization has been building siting infrastructure for many, many years. Does the model change here then, where maybe the data center guys who are, frankly, tech operator runners need to partner with you more as a siting location? Look, this just doesn't work because there's no pipeline there and there's no way for us to make this into a power facility, so we should be looking at these things. Like, do you see almost a change in the business model where you were, frankly, sort of a supplier of electricity wholesale into the grid to now we're more connected, but maybe even another step connected where you're planning together simply because that's what has to happen?
I think the answer is yes. I think it's still evolving. I think one of the things that's been interesting for our own company is the value, I would say, in the legacy assets that, 5 years ago, people would say, they're a little bit older and I don't know how long they're going to run. Are they really needed in the market? I think that dialogue has changed. It certainly has changed here in the province of Alberta, and it's changed in Washington State for our company. I mean, those facilities, like the existing, given the challenge with building new, the existing steel in the ground has a lot of value, I would say. I think the kind of relationships are changing. I mean, look, 3 Mile Island is coming. There's a whole, no, but I mean, they need power, and they need it to run reliably, and that's power that doesn't emit too. So there's a lot of pluses to basically getting that done. I think with some of the larger companies, you might see kind of a backward integration into the supply. So it wouldn't surprise me if some of them buy power generation, or they, we hear examples of people buying an industrial facility and they kind of decommission the industrial facility because it's set up to the grid, right. And rather than having the power drive a steel plant, for example, it'll end up plugging in and driving their data center just to kind of circumvent the timeframes that it costs to get stuff done. So I think all of that is sort of nascent. That was my special word for the day.
Good one.
Nascent.
Nice.
And it'll take some time for us to see it kind of play out, I think.
Okay.
But I think it'll be different than it is today, I think. Do you know what? And I think I think it'll evolve.
So if we think about Canada as a whole, so stepping back from AI just a moment, we've seen Hydro-Quebec announce, they need, I can't remember, but they're in the 30 gigawatts at least over the next 20 years or something like that. They're not talking about AI necessarily, they're just talking about things like EVs, things like taking your home heat and electrifying it, some of those kinds of things. Yeah. And you look at Ontario, we have been, full disclosure, for work in Ontario, and we had a premier who was, no way are we building any more wind farms in this province, and all of a sudden they're back on the agenda again. We've got OPG building a new nuclear power plant. I guess where I'm going is, you've painted a picture which means we need every resource possible. You've got TMI coming back online. I don't know, you tell me, do the Western provinces build a nuclear power plant anytime?
I mean, let me just go to your first point and then come and answer the second point. So when we look at Canada, like BC is going to be short.
BC is short.
BC is short. I think, Manitoba, for all of the hydro that it has, is talking about it being potentially short. I think Ontario is short.
We're short.
I think Quebec is short. And these are all run by crown corporations, right? So when you look at that, and you look at where sort of new load can go in, like if you're a data center or whatever, Alberta becomes, frankly, one of the best jurisdictions to be in, just because it's sort of an open model. It's hard to have, I think, it's hard to have kind of public utilities, building the infrastructure for these kinds of things when really they should be worried about, yes, it could be part of industrial policy, but they're fundamentally worried about making sure that retail consumers, people that are in this room, have reliable and affordable power. Like that's their number one mandate, as opposed to kind of, while they're already short, going in and, I mean, they're worried about EVs, let alone piling in on data centers. So Alberta's one of the few jurisdictions where I think there's a bit of flexibility to deal with things. And candidly, in Alberta, we have a bit of a supply and demand imbalance. So as things go by, I think, you know, we've got more supply relative to the actual demand or load that we see in the province, but the reliability of the jurisdiction, I think, isn't quite where we'll need to be. In other words, we've had a ton of renewables come in, which is great. They've helped decarbonize, but it has, to a certain extent, pushed out gas, in our view, because when it's cold here, like there's no wind.
You've got electrons, but no capacity.
Zero capacity. Well, so the issue is, like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, the amount that we would see sort of supply move in any hour might have been 400 megawatts. Big plant would go away. Today it can be over 2,000. So the need to have kind of reliable generation respond, right? Because let's say the wind stopped blowing, or it's 6 p.m. and the sun goes down, right? So the changes that occur when they do occur, and candidly, if it's super cold, like if it's minus 30, minus 40, there is no wind. Like there's like 2 megawatts of wind. No, seriously, I mean, you can have thousands of megawatts of installed wind. There is none. And the days are short, so solar is gonna help, but it's not gonna be the answer to the question. And so what fills in the gap? You can't just say, oh, you know, sorry, we're gonna shut it down for like 6 hours and you'll be blacked out when it's cold. So there still continues to be a role. So on nuclear, it's hard. Like I gotta say, you know, I see what Sask Power is kind of doing and kind of moving it along. You know, when I think of Alberta, which doesn't really have a government-driven entity, which is drawing the development of these kinds of things, like for a company like ours to get into a nuclear development piece, it's super difficult. I mean, it's probably 10 years, maybe 15 years to get it permitted and built. The costs are super, super high.
And the risks are significant.
Yeah, so I mean, just apples to, rough rule of thumb. So if you just look at 100 megawatts, which is the size of what I would say like a medium-sized wind farm, that might cost you $200 million to build, and it might be available 38% of the time or 35% of the time. A gas plant of that size might cost you $200 million, and it'll be available 97% of the time. To build a nuclear power plant of that size, like an SMR, might cost you over $1 billion. So you need to make sure that the revenue stream for that, setting aside all the technological, regulatory, permitting needs, that kind of the revenue stream to kind of cover that 4 or 5 times more investment, roughly speaking, is enough to kind of justify doing it. And it needs to be certain. So how do we do that in Alberta with our energy-only, price clearing every hour? Like you can't make that investment here. Like we would need to redo I personally think you would need to redo the entire market construct to permit something like that to take place. It's really, really challenging.
Right, so from a market structure perspective.
And technological risk, and writing the check, it's big.
Right. So
unless you guys want to lend us.
We're always willing to lend you money.
That's what
You know that, John.
Yeah, I know.
We'd like to get it paid back, though. That's the only thing. I know.
Given the relationship, Rob, that's a bit harsh on your part, but anyway.
I'm gonna finish off with one question, though. But
sure.
We didn't dig into it too much, but we did talk a little bit about policy. And if I could ask you, what are 2 or 3 things that either our government, our regulators, or even just the public should be thinking about as far as actionable items to enable this? I mean, you have to sit around the board table and sort of say, wow, this is, use your words, generational. This is a generational opportunity. What are the few things we need to do to make sure we capture this generational opportunity?
So one of the things that, I know we've only got 39 seconds left, so I'll be quick. We never used to talk a lot about sort of regulatory design or political risk all that much, I'd say, in the boardroom. I'd say it is a real topic of conversation today when we talk about, growth in terms of going forward. But maybe to answer your question very, very quickly, I'd say 3 things.
No rush. They
But
got time.
we're out of time.
They're on the edge of their seat, John. You got them there.
Great. I hope you're processing that loan that we talked about. So look, one, I would say, I think we need to do a better job of feathering in the renewables with generation attributes that provide reliability. Like I think it's a bit of a free-for-all, if I can put it that way, and I think the market is wonderful. But I think sometimes we have an overly large belief in the market, and there's so many distortions coming in that I'm not sure the market actually works as well as people think it does in meeting all of those solutions. So I think, setting reasonable decarbonization targets with an eye to reliability and affordability for consumers is critical. So maybe a little bit more of a planned or this is kind of the pathway that we want from decarbonization. It's a realistic one, and this is kind of what we're seeing being permitted. Do you know what I mean? And we're going to make sure that there's, these assets are here to provide affordable reliability to make sure the system works well. So I think that would be one. Two, I think Alberta's not bad, but I think generally speaking, permitting, interconnections, all of that takes a hell of a lot of time, a lot longer today than it did before. I don't think, I was at you told me I have time, now I'm going to digress as I do. I was at a session in Oslo, Norway about 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago. And it was there was Team Canada, Team Europe, Team Australia, Team US, Team Japan, and they kind of get together every couple of years and they talk about significant sort of electricity issues that go on. I remember the Canadian contingent began their presentation by just putting a number up on the screen. It was just a number. Remember, we started laughing when we put the number on. And it was the number of days from 2023, I think it was, September of 23, until 2030, kind of, meeting everybody's Paris commitment, that we had to kind of make the transition. Everybody just kind of said, it's impossible to do. Yet everybody, the rhetoric continues, right, about being able to go from point. And look, I'm a firm believer that we need to decarbonize, and I think we will. It's amazing how much we've already done. Our company has done. We've reduced emissions by 10% of Canada's Paris commitment, just TransAlta. You wouldn't see it in the numbers, though, right, because it's backfilled. But just the time it takes to get there is long. And when you look at a big nuclear facility that's new, or Site C in BC, for example, which they're just beginning to, if it takes you 7 years to permit something, you're not going to get there. I'm not saying everything takes 7 years to do, but it takes time. So can we streamline that? Can we, without reducing its effectiveness, if you see what I'm saying? The other thing that is really important from my own perspective is we need to kind of have a stable regime. So being in a place where it's changing all the time, where there's, and don't get me wrong, I think the restructuring stuff that's going on in Alberta is stuff that we need to do. But having a stable regulatory, just stability, is so important. If I knew what the carbon price was going to be in 5 years, as opposed to guessing if there's going to be an election and it be undone, if I knew what kind of the interfaces between the federal government and the provincial government, or I knew what what the market construct is going to be, and had a sense of what pricing was going to be, we can make investment bets then, because we kind of have a sense of pathway sort of stability. But the more turmoil there is in that, you sort of step back, and your shareholders rightly say, what are you guys doing? It's hard to make those kinds of investments. They're risky to do, or the return you need to make those investments is disproportionately high, which means consumers have to pay more to get it done. Not because there's a windfall that the companies are making, because it's the risk and because he refuses to give me loans on good terms. And that's really what it all comes down to. It's really RBC's fault, Rob, I think,
okay.
At the end of the day.
Well, there you go. You heard it here. Well, listen, please thank John for his time and his insights